Hey everyone, how are you all doing? John here with a hopefully brief lecture on ethical decision making processes. This lecture correlates to chapter 4 in our text. I just want to say that chapter 4 is a fairly dense chapter, and it includes a lot of ideas that I think are pretty substantial and important in terms of developing our own individual identities as ethical practitioners. So, in line with that, I want to recommend that you try and set aside some time to read or review, if you've already read the chapter, when you're not rushed and when you really have some room to kind of think about the concepts that the authors are laying out. Now, I'm going to try and keep this lecture concise and not get bogged down too much in those heavy ideas, but instead hopefully provide a little bit of clarity and then underline some things that I think are really essential keys to the chapter and to the area of thinking overall. So ethical decision making is really the process that unfolds as we exercise our ethical judgment, right? We take a look at facts, we consider professional values, actually our own personal values as well, ethical principles, and potential areas of conflict, and we apply intentional decision-making skills to resolve potential dilemmas. We're really shooting for the best possible outcome, and that's the outcome that poses the least risk to everyone involved. Of course, most importantly, we want it to pose the least risk available to the client, right? So one thing that comes through in the chapter, I think, and that I'd sort of hopefully like to offer some clarity about, they talk about, Catoni and Charvitas talk about a lot of different categories of ethical decision-making models. Now, sometimes these categorical systems can overlap, can cover some of the same stuff. It's kind of analogous to categorizing cars by color and by engine size. Well, they're different categorical systems, but you're going to have some black cars that go in the black car category that also go in the fast car category or the slow car category. So as they move between these kind of frames of reference, don't get really hung up in thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, they already said this belongs in this particular model belongs in this other category, or just think of each discussion of categories as a frame of reference, as a way to consider different ways of different ways of approaching ethical decision making. So Beauchamp and Walters talk about a method for resolving moral disagreement in which we obtain objective information, we provide definitional clarity, meaning we kind of get a concrete understanding of what's going on. We look at things in a way that we can label small pieces of things in understandable, comprehensible ways. We adopt a code, so we look to some kind of external apparatus, some kind of external guidance apparatus. We can consider examples and counterexamples, and then we basically conduct analysis. And a related idea is a categorical system of model types in which theoretical or philosophical models represent one type of model, and then practice-based models represent another type of model. Let's forget about specialty practice and kind of lump that in with practice-based for the purpose of our discussion right now. Theoretical, philosophical models, just like they sound, are based on abstract constructs. They're based on theory or philosophy, whereas practice-based models are more specifically geared towards concrete outcomes, towards providing guidance for decision making. Both are important. Both are valuable. We will probably come up against practice-based model types more frequently throughout our careers. Well, and why? Well, ethical codes are practice-based systems, and practice-based systems can be considered objectively. They provide a framework for, say, ethical complaints and discussions. Doesn't mean that theoretical or philosophical ethics are less important. It's just as indicated by the term practice. Practice-based models are a little more pragmatic, a lot more pragmatic. So, Catone, one of our authors, puts forth an organizational framework for considering ethical models. We have principal ethics. So that includes our ethics codes. If you think about the ACA Code of Ethics, and then also Code of Professional Ethics for rehabilitation counselors, both of those documents start out with the principles that we've been talking about recently: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, veracity, justice, and the one that I'm forgetting. And both of those ethics codes and other ethics codes state explicitly that all of the ethical standards in the code proceed from the principles. So principal ethics are what are in your ethics codes, and they're meant to be objective as possible anyway. Virtue ethics, on the other hand, is an approach to ethics in which we try to make decisions based on our idea of virtuous behavior. The example that I always think of is, if you remember the what would Jesus do bracelets that folks used to wear a lot, and perhaps people are still wearing them. I don't seem to see them as much, but little kind of plastic bracelets that people would wear with the letters WWJD on them. And the idea is that as people in their daily lives approach kind of morally ambiguous situations or morally challenging situations, they see their bracelet, and the idea of what would Jesus do in this situation comes to them. They're reminded of that, and then that guides the decisions that they make. Definitely, I think a pretty cool idea. However, as a virtue-based system, why isn't that as effective for us as practitioners? Well, if you're a counselor and I'm a counselor and we each have our What Would Jesus Do bracelets on, and we arrive at ethical dilemmas in our practice, and we both look at our bracelets for inspiration in terms of what to do, your idea of what Jesus would do may be very different from my idea of what Jesus would do. And, obviously that's just one example, but virtue ethics in general are defined much more abstractly and subjectively. How does one follow virtue ethics? By acting like a virtuous person. Of course, this is a difficult and subjective standard to nail down, so it's not applied in our field like principal ethics is, or principal ethics are. Relational ethics is a more modern idea, and we'll actually look at a relational model in a few slides. So I'm not gonna get into it too much now for the sake of time, but we will talk about it in a couple slides. So then, to look at different categories, and you'll see here that some of these overlap with the ones above, and then some of them are new, some of them may cut across. And, that's what I wanted to kind of caution us about getting hung up on. Let's not get hung up on it. There are ethics that are grounded in the philosophy of individual choice, ethics that are grounded in quantification as a means to individual choice. This idea of quantification is represented somewhat by our value sort exercise. You could see if you guys look at my response to the discussion, or the new discussion that I established for this week based on our results from last week, you can see that what I tried to do is extract data from the responses provided by everyone and develop an ordering system based on that. Now, it's true that we're not actually making an ethical decision at the end of our system. Nevertheless, you can see where the system would apply, or a similar system would be applicable to making ethical decisions. And that's what we mean when we talk about quantification. There are practice-derived models of individual choice. We'll look at some practice-derived models, and then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about relational models as well. So, starting first with theoretical or philosophical models of individual choice. One such model is a model by an author named Rest. It developed in 1984. And Rest's model posits that there are 4 major determinants of moral behavior. And we can look at them and we can see that they are all individual qualities, right? Moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral character. All characteristics of individuals that are developmental characteristics. So the idea of developmental is important in considering this framework. And by developmental, I mean that hopefully I'm better equipped to make ethical decisions or moral decisions today than I was yesterday. I've got increased moral sensitivity, and hopefully tomorrow I'll have walked a little further along the path, developed a little further with improved moral judgment, motivation, and character. These individual traits that guide choice. Now, where did Rest get these ideas? He drew on Kohlberg and Piaget, folks who you guys, so Kohlberg, you've heard Kohlberg's stages of moral development, and then Kohlberg's ideas for moral development came from Piaget, who had broader ideas about development. So really we're taking ideas from a broader framework of development and applying them to these individual characteristics and trying to understand what guides moral choice or ethical choice. So in that way, this system is more geared towards understanding than directly facilitating behavior. So we can see again here how this is a different system than principle ethics, and we can understand why it doesn't apply as directly to practice as principle ethics does. So the quantification system, again, think about our exercise this week where, basically we quantified values, right? And we assigned numerical values to those values. So this can actually be done with specific ethical decisions, whereby you identify or acknowledge the decision that needs to be made, list out pros and cons, add some structure to the decision or hang the decision on some structure. So you might think in terms of a flow chart, and then actually assign numerical values to the different possible outcomes and consequences of different outcomes, and apply mathematical logic and try and weave your way through ethical decision making that way. I think quantification can be especially helpful at, say, an agency level or the level of some other kind of big system. I don't think in terms of a practical approach that you can really bring to the office for each individual ethical decision you make throughout the day. Probably not as much, right? On the other hand, practice-based decision-making models are designed for just that. They're grounded in a sort of the collective depth of clinical experience, and they draw on that to help steer us towards good outcomes. If you take a look on page 63 in our book, there's a table that outlines a whole series of practice-based models, and it's a really kind of nice way to get a sense of what exactly they are. Probably a little more clear than the description I just provided. So then a whole kind of different ball of wax would be models of relational influence. And models of relational influence really seek to frame the dynamics of ethical decision making in terms of social dynamics. I think Catone's social constructivism model helps illustrate this really clearly. The basic premise of social constructivism, it's sociological theory that exists certainly independently outside of our field, and that our field borrows from, actually, in counseling theory, and then here we see also in ethical decision making. Social constructivism and social constructionism posit that the primary sense of reality resides in social dynamics. So I think maybe if I throw a for instance at you, it might make it the easiest. Let's pretend I'm working back at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And as you guys know, I am a white guy. I'm lucky enough to have a pretty stable professional gig. And of course, I've faced my challenges in life, but I do have the privilege of some concrete advantages where the world has taught me some lessons that the world maybe hasn't taught the same to some folks who don't have these same privileges. For example, in my experience, generally, if you work hard and try and do the right thing, things are going to work out fairly decently for you. That's not going to necessarily be the experience of someone who has maybe immigrated to the United States later in life from a country where they were under duress, and maybe they are an ethnic minority, so visually they're identified as a minority. They don't have the advantages of kind of getting all of the social cues that we have embedded in our society. So this person hasn't necessarily learned from the world that if you work hard and try to do the right thing, things are going to work out okay, because that's not true in the case of someone who flees a war-torn country, right? So that's the basic framework of social constructivism, that your social circumstances really dictate your reality, and that it's important to understand that. I don't want to assume that every person's background in history is going to kind of have the same marks of privilege that mine does. And I know privilege is a buzzword right now, but it's quite honestly the way that I've always thought about this idea long before it became kind of a political thing. So in any case, let's say we've got me in my office as a counselor and an individual who immigrated to the country later in life, joined the service, after the service ran into some difficult circumstances and ends up homeless. Well, when that person schedules an appointment with my administrative assistant on my calendar and comes up to my office, there's a real power differential in that room, whether I want there to be or not. So the idea with a social constructivist model is that I'm cognizant of that power differential, and that the ethical decisions that I make are primarily informed by that. So say, for example, when there's a really evident power differential, I would want to be extra aware of the possibility that I'm just kind of railroading somebody and making decisions for them instead of with them, and that the social dynamic is contributing to that, because the client, our imaginary client, doesn't have a sense of power to speak up for themselves, if you will. Conversely, let's say I'm working with a client who is a retired officer, native-born Caucasian American, who happens to be entitled to vocational rehabilitation benefits. Well, we're going to be in a different situation there, right? The power distribution is going to be a lot more equitable. Doesn't mean you don't want to be careful to not railroad a plan on that person. It just means that's probably not your primary concern. So does that make sense, I hope? Social constructivism, social constructionism is a pretty nifty idea so when implementing a social constructivist model, we obtain information. So we'd want to know, say in this example, the background of the veteran that we're working with. We want to assess the nature of the relationship, where we see that it's a disabled veteran on one hand and a counselor on the other hand. We want to consult expert opinion, so that can be colleagues, that can be literature, or our ethics codes. And then when disagreement arises, or sort of discordant agendas, we want to negotiate in a context that's informed by these other dynamics, right? And we want to make sure that our responses are oriented towards arriving at a reasonable consensus. Again, avoiding railroading. In our example, there's certainly many other things other than railroading, but just in this particular example. So we talked a little bit in the last few slides about principle ethics, virtue ethics, relational ethics, and then also practice-derived ethics, practice-derived ethics. Well, the Tarvidas integrative decision-making model, modeled by the other author of our book, Vilya Tarvidas, who is actually a rehabilitation professor, rehabilitation counseling professor, good friends with Dr. Gulen and with many other colleagues of mine throughout the field. I don't know her personally, but a lot of people do. She's apparently a pretty neat lady and has definitely left an important mark on our field. Dr. Tarvidas's model seeks to account for all of these influences. It considers principle ethics, so your ethics codes, and the principles that underlie ethics codes, virtue ethics, so the characteristics of the counselor. Now, virtue ethics is also, of course, going to have some overlap with, if you remember, the REST model, the developmental model of philosophical and theoretical ethics, and then also relational ethics. So the model is really seeking to have decisions that arise as a function of the intersection of these influences. So we'll kind of take a quick look at some specifics from the model. But I do want to say that I really think the most important thing, especially for our discussion right now, is that you can think in terms of this model, that we can think in terms of this model. I don't necessarily see folks getting out a piece of paper and working out their dilemmas on a day-to-day basis, formally following the model, but to have a framework in your mind where you're considering things in terms of principle ethics, in terms of virtue ethics or individual ethics, and then also relational ethics. I think that's very important, and I think that's the kind of the chief quality of the model. And it can be applied at a clinical level. You know, one-to-one, counselor-client. It can be applied between professionals at an interdisciplinary level, and then at institutional and societal levels as well. It can guide decisions that agencies make, and then decisions related to public policy, say license legislation. In the model itself, there are several components within each stage that are tied to specific themes and attitudes. In the whole kind of way of thinking is reflective of ethical decision-making theory, and then also makes a contribution to ethical decision-making theory. So just looking at this really quickly, we're not going to read every bullet, and I don't expect everyone to have this committed to memory after our discussion here. But as you go through and look at these different stages and the components within the stages, what comes across is having an awareness that's informed by a variety of perspectives that are rooted in relational principle, excuse me, and philosophical ethics. So we interpret situations, we're collecting information, we're seeking to enhance our sensitivity to certain dynamics. We want to identify who stakeholders are, and we move forward towards formulating an ethical decision. So I think what's significant here is stage 2 is formulating. It's not doing, it's formulating. So we have this kind of slow, intentional process that's informed by a deep review of the problem, consideration of consequences, and other influences like ethical codes. Then we move to step 3. We're still not doing. Instead, we're selecting an action. So there's an intentionality to each of these steps that's important. You kind of arrive at a slower process intellectually. I'm not saying put your decisions off, but I'm saying as you make your ethical decisions, you're not jumping from here's the dynamic presented to you, okay, now I've got an outcome. The cognitive process is a little more deliberate. Maybe deliberate's a better word than slow. And then step 4, planning and executing. So we make our choice and we plan for potential barriers or consequences that might arise as a result of our choice. Because in ethical decisions, is there always a perfect choice? Is there frequently a perfect choice? No. We're dealing in risk management. We want the best choice for all concerned parties. It's not going to be perfect, so we need to plan for the fallout related to our best but imperfect decision. And you kind of put this all together, and you can look at the flow of it going down the page there and see how it's an effective tool for building awareness. And I think the Tarvidas model is also an effective topic to conclude on, because it seeks to wrap together so many of the other influences that we talked about in the first part of this talk and then throughout chapter 4. Thanks for listening, you all. Hope you have a good weekend or had a good weekend, and we will talk soon.